Hi everybody, welcome. I'm so happy that you're joining me in this class for Art History 1B. Now, some of you might have taken Art History 1A, and if that's true, you can skip this presentation unless you'd like a quick overview of what we covered in that class. And some of you are new to art history and you're starting with this B class, which is totally fine. You don't have to take Art History 1A to take Art History 1B. But I did want to give you a little kind of overview for a few minutes just to kind of summarize what we covered in Art History 1A, because it's kind of like today's world. Sometimes things that happen in the past can affect style and taste in the future, and that's true with the history of art. So let me give you just a little bit of an overview of some of the figurative art, or the art that describes the human body and human subject in the ancient world. So I'll just go through a few of the slides of this PowerPoint. This is something I usually do to open up my class with. So we're going to go back to the early days, to the BC times, around the year 500, maybe even a little earlier. Actually, we get into the Egyptian art and take us to about 1300. That's sort of the century that precedes the era where we're going to get going here. Or actually, it's about right where we're going to start with the proto or early Renaissance. So you don't have to take notes, just sit back, kind of absorb some of the concepts, have in your mind's eye what was going on and how ancient artists were describing humans. So let me minimize myself here, and we'll move forward with this PowerPoint. Okay. Do you happen to recognize which civilization is responsible for this sculpture? It's definitely a man and a woman. In fact, they are royalty from, you got it, Egypt. So we are looking at an Old Kingdom era sculpture of a pharaoh with his primary wife. Sometimes they were married to more than one woman, and you can tell that they're married by the fact that she has her arms wrapped around her husband. You can see her hand at his waist and holding his arm, standing side by side. Now, it wasn't uncommon, as you know, Egyptians are famous for believing in an afterlife and believing in mummification, wrapping deceased pharaoh's body and drying it out, and using resin-treated bandages and different mysterious techniques. Some, for the most part, we know what they were doing. But in any event, the idea is that they still recognized. The idea of the goal was to guarantee the preservation of the body after death so that the spirit of the deceased, that they called the Ka, could travel back and forth between the afterlife and return to kind of repossess the body. But they created these statues as kind of a backup plan in case something should happen to the mummy, some kind of deterioration. It was stolen, something happens, right? And so they would create these funerary sculptures, and that's what we're looking at here. Alrighty, so for the first thing they would do, of course, is sculpt out of something very durable that's not going to crumble or break easily, and so they would often use a stone like that. What you find also is the pharaohs are often depicted in their kind of pharaonic costume. You see the headdress, their ceremonial beard that they would be depicted or wear in real life, right? And then you have kind of a kilt-like tunic, but otherwise they are shirtless. You do see that the figures are in proportion though, right? You don't see oversized heads or elongated backs or legs. You have a body type that's fairly relatable in that regard. They would often depict their kings or pharaohs, though idealized and not individualized. So you would often find that pharaohs are depicted in kind of a cookie cutter way, in sort of the prime of their life, with sort of a generic face. It doesn't have any kind of distinguishing features that separates the way the pharaoh looks here from another later pharaoh that would come along in a different dynasty. The other thing you would find is that they often are front-facing depictions. So no side view, no twisted view of maybe a combination of both front and side. Always a presentation to the front. And the other thing they would do to enliven the figure is they would slide 1 foot forward. It almost looks like they're about to take a step. You see it a little bit subtly with the queen here too. That is, again, it's almost, but it looks, you see how the knees are still locked? You have this just a foot, it's almost like it's a piece of ice under his foot that's sliding that foot forward a little bit. All of this would be a repeated kind of recipe, whether in the early days of Egypt or in the final few dynasties of Egypt. This was, for the most part, kind of the formula to depict the human body. Let's move forward now and see what other depictions of the body existed. So moving out of Egypt across into the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea, we arrive in Greece. And around the year 600 here, we have an early depiction of a Greek statue that looks a little familiar. You might see that that statue's foot is slid forward as well. So this is one of those influences actually from Egypt on ancient Greece. So in their earliest sculptural output, we have a depiction of what they would call a kouros, or a male youth. And it's here we see something like what we saw in Egypt, right? A figure that's relatively proportional. It also has kind of a generic face, with the foot slid forward, frontal position, arms to the side. And yet at the same time, there's one very distinctive difference between what you saw in Egypt and what you see in Greece, and that is they were not shy about nudity. That only applies to subjects who were males, and we're going to continue to see this embrace of the human body. It becomes sort of something they're passionate about. It becomes a quest that they go on towards perfecting the description of the human body in its most naturalistic ways. And when you think about their culture, right, the Olympic Games were born in Greece. They say some of the games, the competitions were done in the nude. The gods the Greeks worshiped, their pantheon of gods and goddesses took human form as well. So there's a real obsession on the human body on the part of the ancient Greeks. Now, here we are in the year 600. Look, within probably a half a century, you get something that looks like this. This is sort of this almost fast pass kind of experience with increasing naturalism in the description of the human body that you find in ancient Greece. Look at this more, figure. You have now something that, again, another marble statue. You still have that foot slid forward. You still have the arms kind of bound to the side in a stiff way, but in a generic face. But what you find is a body that is describing both the kind of the firmness of the musculature and bone structure with kind of the fleshiness as well. So again, a physique that looks increasingly like many of our bodies, if you are male in particular. Then moving on to the next century, in the year 480, you have the Critias boy. This is a statue we study in Art History 1A, because here, though the face is incredibly generic, we have a body that almost looks like something that could become alive, right? Of course, it's a marble statue, but it has an incredible naturalism. Again, it's that mix of, fleshiness and firmness, just like the human body is. It feels like if you were to touch it, it would have that kind of tactile experience of fleshy and firm at the same time. But there's also something called the contrapposto stance. It's a weight shift that they start to describe. They abandon that foot slid forward look with the locked knees that looks so strange. And now there's a little give in the knee. While one leg stays straight, holding up the body, the other leg relaxes. It's kind of like how our bodies behave when we're in line at Starbucks, right? You take a load off of one leg and let the other one do the work supporting the body. Well, that affects the whole alignment of the body all the way up through the hips, all the way up through the shoulders. So it's a more believable stance that the Greeks invent, and it will be mimicked by artists for centuries. Again, a contrast. In a very short amount of time, we see how quickly the Greeks are very interested in perfecting the description in a naturalistic way of the human body. This statue is called the Spear Bearer. He would have held a spear originally, but again, another of these heroic nudes. Again, a celebration of the human body, particularly the male human body. There's that contrapposta stance you can see on a statue that has not sustained the same level of damage as the earlier one. Now the Romans, fast forwarding on to the 1st century AD or CE, or the Common Era, we find that we have a ruler who is one of many emperors depicted in this statue as a portrait of Augustus, who was one of many rulers of the Roman Empire who used art and sculpture to promote themselves and to promote certain messaging. But what you also find in the arts of this period of time is the Romans were huge fans of Greek naturalism. They just weren't fans of the nudity. So when you look at a sculpture like this, you see a man who is powerful with his general's chest plate. He's got his finger raised, looking like a leader. You know, this is something we see a lot of our, presidents, when they give addresses to the nation. They raise their finger in a gesture of leadership, of, addressing the future of the country. And that contrapposta stance is evident there as well. Not so much later, though. We find also that when civilizations collapse, sometimes the priorities of an earlier era are forgotten, and then we start to see a decline in naturalism. Sometimes that's a choice, though, and so in the final kind of few weeks of Art History 1A, we go into Byzantine and medieval art, where we start to see figures that reflect less naturalism, less interest in the human body. They read flat, like paper dolls. They no longer inhabit naturalistic contexts. Instead, they have, in this era of Christianity, sort of these golden backdrops that are sort of references to heaven or otherworldly supernatural realms. And then finally, when we get into the medieval art, which is the era that precedes the Renaissance, we find the distortion of the human body completely fine, as you can see in this sculpture of an Old Testament figure here that decorates a Gothic church in France from the 12th century. You find that he is elongated and stretched like a piece of taffy. His legs form this sort of stylized X. Who stands like that? I don't even think a yoga class would make you do that. So again, he's disproportionate. He doesn't have the incredible naturalism we saw in the description of the human body that was perfected by the ancient Greeks. Heck, he's not even as naturalistic as some of the depictions of the Egyptian pharaohs. So this is where we're going. We have this pendulum from naturalism to a distortion of the human body, again, which is perceived as, in medieval times in the Byzantine world, as okay, that holy subject shouldn't look like you and I. So this push and pull back and forth is something we're going to see, this pendulum swing, as we examine the history of art. But first, we're going to begin in the Proto-Renaissance, where they're going to look less at art that looks like this, and they're going to swing back 1,000 years or more to the classical world of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and revive or give birth to kind of a second chapter in naturalism. So Stay tuned for that.